The Grand Glamour Hotel has a way of swallowing time. You punch in, sit behind the polished oak desk, and before you know it, it's morning. At least that's how it used to feel. Lately, every shift feels like an eternity. Maybe it's me. 7 years of night shifts will do that to you. I took this job because it was steady and clean. No grease traps, no fluorescent lit offices. Just a beautiful lobby, soft music humming through the air, and enough quiet to hear your own thoughts. But 7 years of quiet can grind you down. Every night's the same. Guests with too much luggage and not enough patience, an occasional drunk stumbling back from the bar, and the silence that creeps in around 2 a.m., thick and heavy like a blanket. I lean back in my chair, staring at the chandelier overhead, its crystals glinting faintly in the dim light. I used to think it was beautiful. Now it just feels like part of the scenery, a static prop in the never-ending play that is my life. 36 and going nowhere. That's what my sister likes to remind me every time we talk. Why don't you go back to school or start your own business? She'd say, like it's that easy. I wanted to be a teacher once. That feels like another life now. Sometimes when I'm sitting here, I imagine walking out the front doors and never coming back. Just disappearing into the night. But where would I go? What would I do? I shook off the thought and glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. I picked up my radio and pressed the button. "Jerome, you awake back there?" A burst of static crackled before his voice came through, low and steady. "Wide awake. Got my coffee and everything. What's up?" Jerome's been the night security guard here for 5 years. Solid guy, steady, funny in a quiet sort of way. We've worked together long enough that we can talk without really saying much. I like that about him. He's the kind of guy who doesn't ask too many questions, not like the others who used to work here, always prying into my personal life. Jerome just exists, and on nights like these, that's all I want. "Nothing much," I said, spinning my pen between my fingers. "Just checking in. It's dead out here." "Dead back here too," he replied. "Guess everyone's asleep. You should be glad. Makes for an easy night." I smirked. Easy's boring. Boring's safe. He had a point. I was about to reply when something outside caught my eye. I turned toward the glass doors at the front of the lobby. The streetlights were dim, barely cutting through the mist that had started to roll in. At first, I thought it was the usual winter fog. Normal for this time of year. But this wasn't normal. It was red. Pale, rusty red, like old blood. It crept low to the ground, thick and slow, swirling in strange patterns as it edged closer to the hotel. The street beyond was gone, swallowed by the mist. I couldn't even see the lamppost across the street. "Jerome," I said into the radio, my voice quieter now. "You seeing this fog?" There was a pause before his reply. "Yeah, I saw it a few minutes ago on the cameras. Creepy as hell. Never seen anything like it." Do we call someone? Weather service or something?" He let out a short laugh. "What are we gonna say?" "Hi, there's weird red fog outside. Please advise." "They'll think we've lost it." I didn't laugh. My stomach twisted as I stared at the fog, its shifting patterns hypnotic. It didn't feel right. "You have a point. Let me know if anything changes." "Sure thing, boss," Jerome replied, his voice light. But then, a few moments later, he came back on the radio. Miranda?" "Yes?" "Some of the windows are open. Second floor, maybe third." My heart sank. I hadn't even thought about the windows. "Can you close them?" I asked, gripping the radio tighter. "I'll try, but..." He trailed off, and the static hissed louder for a second. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost trembling. "Miranda, I think something's out there." "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's in the fog. I just saw it. Something moving. It's looking straight at me." My throat went dry. "Jerome, get back inside, now." The radio went silent. I stared at it, willing him to respond, to say something, anything, but the only sound was the low hum of static. My eyes darted back to the glass doors. The fog was still there, pressing closer, thicker now. And then I saw it. A shadow in the mist. It was tall, its outline barely visible through the swirling red haze. My pulse raced as it moved, steady and intentional, before vanishing into the fog like it had never been there at all. The radio crackled again, and Jerome's voice came through, sharp and panicked. "Miranda, you need to close the windows. You need to—" His words cut off abruptly, replaced by a sharp burst of static. The radio wasn't responding anymore. I slammed it onto the desk, frustration boiling in my chest. The static hissed faintly, broken only by soft pops and crackles, but Jerome's voice was gone. My pulse thudded in my ears as I stared at it, willing him to respond. Nothing. I didn't know if he was ignoring me or if something worse had happened. My eyes darted back to the fog, still pressing against the glass doors, its pale red glow pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The shadow I'd seen earlier was gone, but that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made everything worse. I couldn't just sit here. The windows upstairs were still open. The fog hadn't forced its way in yet, but it didn't have to, not if the building was inviting it inside. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I stood and moved toward the grand staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was wading through something invisible, something that didn't want me to move. The polished marble floors below gave way to the soft carpet of the second-floor landing. The air was colder up here, almost freezing, and carried the sharp metallic tang I'd first noticed in the lobby. Every breath stung the back of my throat as I approached the first room. Room 213 was the first stop. The door was ajar, just enough for a faint strip of light to spill into the hallway. I stopped just outside, straining to hear anything inside. Movement, breathing, anything. But the room was silent, too silent. I nudged the door open with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the dimness inside. The room was still. The bed was unmade, the covers hanging loosely over the side. The curtains were half drawn, their edges brushing against the windowsill, and the air smelled like old pennies. I closed the window, and as my flashlight swept the floor, my stomach tightened. Drag marks stretched across the carpet from the bed to the closet, the kind of marks you'd see if someone had been pulled. I didn't want to look. My fingers tightened on the flashlight as I approached the closet, my breathing shallow. The door was cracked open just enough to show a sliver of darkness. "Hello?" My voice felt too loud. No response. I nudged the door open, the hinges letting out a low groan. The closet was empty, or so it seemed. The walls were bare except for scratches etched deep into the plaster, the jagged letters forming a single repeating phrase. "It's here." Before I could move, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, slamming the bathroom door shut with a sharp crack. My heart leapt as the sound echoed around me. I stumbled back, the flashlight beam jerking wildly, and nearly dropped it as I bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The hallway felt darker now. The sconces on the walls flickered faintly, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. My legs felt heavier with every step as I approached room 405. I stopped short when I heard it, screaming, muffled, desperate, high-pitched. It was coming from inside the room. "Are you okay in there?" I called, my voice cracking. The screaming didn't stop. It sounded like someone being dragged across the floor, like someone begging to be let out. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob and twisted it open. The room was empty. The screaming cut off abruptly, replaced by the faint creak of the wardrobe door swinging back and forth on its hinges. The entire room was chaos. The bed was overturned, the mattress half off the frame. The wardrobe was wide open, its contents scattered across the floor, clothes, towels, shoes, all thrown in every direction like someone had been searching for something in a frenzy. The curtains hung limp, one of them torn halfway from the rod. I stepped inside cautiously, the beam of my flashlight darting over the wreckage. "What is going on here?" I murmured. I bent down, sweeping the light under the bed. Nothing. Straightening up, I went toward the window, my fingers brushing the frame as I reached to close it. I turned toward the door to leave, and then I heard it. A soft, deliberate tapping coming from the window. My blood froze. This was the 6th floor. I swallowed hard and turned toward the sound. The curtains swayed slightly, their edges brushing against the glass like they were alive. The tapping came again, louder this time. My hand moved on its own, gripping the edge of the curtain. Slowly I pulled it aside. I saw nothing, just the red fog swirling outside, thick and restless. But then it appeared, a face, distorted, pale and pressed against the glass. Its features were wrong, stretched too wide, too angular, as if the fog itself was shaping it. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. My back hit the edge of the dresser and I sank to the ground, chest heaving. When I finally found the courage to look up, the face was gone. The window was empty, the fog churning harmlessly beyond the glass. I blinked several times, my breath catching as I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. "It's just the exhaustion," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You're imagining things." But deep down I knew that wasn't true. The sound of laughter stopped me. It came from the hallway, light, airy, almost playful, but wrong. So wrong. I spun, my flashlight slicing through the doorway, but the hallway was empty. The laughter faded into silence, leaving only the low hum of the lights overhead. I backed out of the room, my skin crawling, and shut the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I clutched the flashlight tighter. Room 616 was at the far end of the hall, its door wide open. The red glow from the window spilled into the hallway, pooling around my feet like a warning. The beam flickered as I stepped inside, casting jittery shadows across the walls. The room felt wrong. The air was damp, heavy, and carried the overwhelming smell of rot. The carpet squished underfoot, soaked through with something dark and sticky. The bed was bare, stripped of its sheets. The window was wide open, the fog swirling just beyond the sill. A faint, rhythmic drip broke the silence, pulling my gaze upward. I swung the flashlight toward the ceiling, the beam catching something that shouldn't have been there. It moved slowly, crawling in stiff, uneven motions, its limbs angular and unnatural. The figure clung to the ceiling, its form shadowed but unmistakably wrong. Something wet glistened where its mouth should have been, dark streaks trailing downward to pool on the floor below, its head tilted sharply, the motion abrupt as if it wasn't made to move that way. Though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze lock onto me, heavy and cold. A low, wet rasp broke the silence. I turned and ran. The hallway blurred as I rushed, my pulse pounding in my ears. The walls around me seemed to shift, the corners stretching and bending in ways they shouldn't. The radio hissed faintly at my side, then crackled to life.
"Miranda!"
Jerome's voice was weak, broken by static.
I'm in the basement."
I stopped, clutching the radio like it might keep me upright. "Jerome, are you hurt? What happened?"
Just come quick,"
he rasped. His voice was wrong, thick and wet, like he was choking on something.
"Please."
The line went dead. The basement door loomed ahead like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The flashlight in my hand flickered weakly, and every instinct screamed at me to turn around. But Jerome was down there. Or at least I hoped he was still Jerome. The thought of his voice, rasping through the static, drove me forward. He's hurt. He needs help. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the metal scraping against the frame. A wave of cold air hit me, damp and heavy, carrying that same metallic tang I'd smelled in the hallway. My chest tightened as I stared down the staircase, the light from the upper floors barely reaching the first few steps. "Jerome?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. No response. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound too loud in the suffocating silence. The air grew colder as I went deeper, sharp enough to sting my lungs. The staircase spiraled downward, the walls narrowing around me until it felt like I was walking into the throat of something alive. At the bottom, the basement stretched before me, a long corridor lined with old rusting pipes and flickering overhead lights. The floor was slick, water pooling in uneven patches, and the walls were stained with something dark and oily. "Jerome?" I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. This time I heard it, a faint, wet sound, like someone breathing through broken glass. It came from the far end of the corridor, where the shadows pooled thick and heavy. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward the noise, each step slower than the last. The storage room door was open. Inside, the light was dim, the single overhead bulb swaying gently on its chain. The shelves were lined with old boxes, their edges warped and stained from years of dampness. The room looked empty, just rows of shelving and scattered debris. And then I saw him. Jerome was crouched in the corner, his back to me. His shoulders rose and fell in uneven bursts, and his hands were pressed tightly against the wall as if he were bracing himself. His uniform was soaked, clinging to his body, and his hair hung limply over his face. "Jerome," I said, stepping closer. "Are you okay? What happened?" He didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, wet, and rattling, and the sound made my stomach churn. I stopped a few feet away, the flashlight beam trembling as I pointed it toward him. "Jerome?" His head twitched, a slow, unnatural motion like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "What's going on?" My voice cracked as I took a step back. "We need to leave. There's something in the hotel."
"It's already here,"
he said, his voice overlapping with something deeper, wetter, like another voice speaking through him.
"And it wants you."
My breath caught as he turned fully, rising to his feet in a single jerky motion.
"Run,"
he said, the word distorted, almost mechanical. I barely had time to react, the flashlight slipping from my hand as I stumbled backward. He moved too fast, his movements chaotic and unnatural. I turned and bolted, my feet splashing through the water as I sprinted back toward the staircase. The sound of his pursuit was deafening, his heavy, wet footsteps slapping against the concrete, his breathing a guttural rasp that echoed through the corridor. I didn't dare look back. The staircase loomed ahead, but the light at the top seemed farther away than it should have been. My legs burned as I climbed, my hands gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles ached.
"Miranda,"
his voice called from behind me, distorted and layered, overlapping with something inhuman.
"you can't leave. It won't let you."
I reached the top and slammed the door shut behind me, twisting the lock into place. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the cold metal, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Then the door shook. The impact nearly knocked me off my feet, the metal rattling violently as something heavy slammed against it. I stumbled away, my eyes darting around the lobby. The fog outside was thicker now, its pale red glow spilling through the windows. The pounding on the door grew louder, the metal groaning under the force. I didn't wait to see what would happen if it broke. My feet carried me toward the front desk, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. I could feel the fog pressing against the building, wrapping itself around the walls, seeping into the air. The pounding stopped.
"Miranda."
The voice came from behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. Jerome stood in the center of the lobby, his body bent and broken, his grin stretching impossibly wide. The shadows around him seemed to shift and pulse, the fog curling at his feet like it was alive.
"You can't run,"
he said, his voice layered and wet.
"It's already inside."
The fog surged through the cracks in the windows, spilling into the lobby like a living thing. It swirled around him, wrapping him in its pale red glow. His body twisted further, his limbs stretching and bending until they were no longer human. I ran, the fog chasing me, curling around my ankles and pulling at my legs as I sprinted toward the front doors. The glass was cracking, the edges spidering outward with each pulse of the fog, but I didn't stop. The last thing I saw before I burst through the doors and into the cold night was Jerome's twisted, grinning face, staring at me through the fog. The fog stayed behind. That was the first thing I realized as I stumbled out into the street, gasping for air. The red haze pulsed against the hotel windows but didn't follow me. It just stayed there, pressing against the glass, writhing like something alive. The cold air burned my lungs as I collapsed onto the pavement. My body felt heavier with every breath, like I'd run a marathon. My head swam with the images of Jerome, what used to be Jerome, and the thing crawling on the ceiling. I wanted to vomit, but there was nothing left inside me. The city around me was dead. No cars, no pedestrians, no life. Just an endless quiet broken only by the faint hum of the streetlights. The fog had swallowed everything past the hotel. Its glow reflected faintly in the windows of nearby buildings, casting the whole block in a dim, rust-colored haze. I didn't remember how long I sat there before the sirens came. The police arrived at dawn. 2 squad cars and an ambulance pulled up to the curb, their lights painting the street in flashes of blue and red. I tried to explain what had happened, what I'd seen, but the words felt useless. How do you tell someone about the fog that watches you, about the twisted, broken thing that used to be a person? They didn't believe me. Of course they didn't. When the officers entered the Grand Glamour, there was no fog, no shattered glass, no crawling thing, no Jerome, just silence, the kind that stretches on forever, daring you to fill it. The lobby was empty when they came out. They found overturned furniture in some of the rooms, sure, and scratches on the walls in others, but there was no blood, no bodies, no sign of anything unusual. The ambulance tech checked me over, shining a light in my eyes and asking me questions I couldn't answer. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jerome's face. I took a week off, a full 7 days away from the Grand Glamour, away from the fog, away from whatever was left of Jerome. My sister came to visit, and I told her I was thinking about quitting. Good, she said, sipping her coffee like it was the most obvious thing in the world. You've been stuck there for too long anyway. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. Quitting should have felt like freedom, like a way out of the life I'd built for myself. But all I could think about was the fog and the things it left behind. By the time my week was up, I'd convinced myself it was over. Whatever had happened that night was gone now, some weird trick of the mind or an isolated incident. The hotel had been checked over, cleaned, reopened. Life was moving on. I wasn't, not really. When I stepped back into the Grand Glamour, it felt different. The lobby was brighter than I remembered, the chandelier overhead sparkling in the morning sunlight. The air smelled like polish and lemon, and the marble floors gleamed as if nothing had ever touched them. Good to see you back, Miranda, the day manager said with a polite smile. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile of my own. The first few nights were normal, boring even. Guests came and went, the lobby was quiet, and the radio stayed silent except for routine check-ins with the new security guard, a guy named Paul who didn't seem to know how to stop talking. On the 5th night, I found a note on the desk. It wasn't there when I started my shift. It read, "Welcome back." The handwriting was familiar. It was Jerome's. Hello there, thank you for watching. How did you like the creepy atmosphere in this story? Do let me know in the comments below. If you want a similar story, check the story on screen. Lastly, if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay creepy and see you in the next story.